The quilt top measures 54 by 55. Yours might be a little bit different if you starched your pre-cuts before you sewed, or maybe your pre-cuts were a little bit different size, so always measure your own quilt top. If you're sending something to be long arm, generally 4 inches are needed on each side, so 4, 4, 4, 4, that's 8 inches total all the way around. Comes up to 62 by 63. The reason being, when your quilt gets put on a long arm, there are what's called leader and under cloths here and here. So everything is going to get pinned to these cloths. And then if you're doing edge-to-edge pantograph, it's going to run a little bit over on top and a little bit over on bottom. So you can't short your quilter. And then on the sides, there are quilt clamps that come in and hold your fabric. So you have your long arm frame over here, and then there's a little bungee and a clamp and a bungee and a clamp. So you need room for these clamps, because as the machine moves, you don't want it to hit these clamps. And again, for pantographs, you want your design to be able to run all the way across your quilt. So you need a little extra. I'll show you the long arm process at the end of this video. If you're going to quilt this yourself on your domestic machine, you're probably fine with an extra 2 inches on all sides. Again, that's so when you're doing your quilting, you have room to run it off on either side, and the fabric will shrink up a bit as you quilt. As far as batting is concerned, I don't necessarily need it this big when I'm long arming, but I need it bigger than this. So I usually go through my scrap pile or see what I have that's close to this, something that gives me a little extra around. Same thing if I'm domestic machine quilting. It doesn't really have to be exact, but I would say give yourself a little extra batting, and then your backing, I like to have a little bit more of that, and that's just personal preference. So how are you going to get to these measurements? I'm going to long arm this quilt. So let's look at some ideas how I can get to this size. So we're going to work on our backing fabric, and I'm going to tell you that if you go online and you search for how to calculate backing fabric, you will find all different sorts of calculations. Some of them remind me of algebra and kind of give me a headache. I had enough math in college. What I tend to do is, if I have a wide back, if it's a bigger quilt, I'll buy a wide back fabric, which is 108 inches from selvage to selvage. So if I had a big quilt, I really like these, because then I can just buy a piece as wide as I need, and I'm covered top to bottom, and I don't have to piece anything. I'm going to need to piece this. The reason I will is if you buy a regular fabric, it runs about 40 to 42 inches selvage to selvage as it comes off the bolt. There are some wide backs, I think, that run, I've seen some odd ones that are like 50 inches, and I've seen some that run, I think, about 64 inches. You'll find all different kinds. So if I happen to have a piece of 64-inch wide back, that would work for this. But I'm going to go ahead and piece off a bolt. Let's do that together. This is a nice colorful quilt. Pretty much anything will go with it. I happen to have this Bella Solid green tea, a nice bright green. I'm going to work with this. Let's go ahead and open some off the bolts here. I do keep a couple bolts on hand. I watch for when they go on sale, and then I look for solids that generally will go with my favorite color range. That way I have a few. Here's your selvage edge, and you go all the way down to the other selvage edge. This will not be enough to take me top to bottom, clearly. I'm going to have to piece it together. What I like to do with mine, when I long arm my own quilts, is roll out enough. Let me move this down. To give me the extra I'm going to need on each edge. So I know I need about 4 inches. That looks good. Now we're going to go to the other end. That's going to be about 4 inches right there. I'm going to put a mark there. Move that tripod out of the way. I've got stuff all over the table since I'm filming. going to mark that. And I'm going to cut myself a piece. Then I'm going to cut another piece the exact same size, and I'm going to stitch them together. That almost fell. I'm going to stitch them together along the selvage line. So there will be a seam in my backing, which I am fine with, and then I will end up having a little bit extra because lengthwise it'll be probably about 80 inches and I only need 62 top to bottom. That's fine with me. The reason I like to piece on the selvage, and this is personal preference, I know when I'm matching my fabrics together to sew, let's pretend these are two separate pieces. So I'm matching them together. It's really easy to match the edges, and then I'll use a wider seam and stitch it together. And then when I put this on my long arm, I've got that nice clean selvage edge at the top and on the bottom. It makes it easier for me to pin. Let's make our backing. I'm going to switch to this foot, no guide, so I can sew whatever seam allowance I want. I'm going to match my selvage edges. The selvage has the fuzzy edge, and you can see two lines of dots, so I want to make sure that I'm sewing inside of that. That's a pretty big seam allowance. What I usually do is I bring it to the foot, I look for where the dots are, I make sure I'll be sewing inside, and then I look at the numbers on my needle plate. This may or may not be the quote correct way to do it, but this works, so I'm good with it. There's a number here, 5/8 of an inch, and it's got a nice little groove, so I know if I sew along this line, I'll be good. To help me, I'm going to build a little tape ledge right there. You can use painter's tape, or I have this white tape that's already on there. It's called label tape. I used it to label some drawers and cords. It doesn't leave a sticky residue. So I'm going to grab a piece. It's nice and thick too, where my 5/8 inch line is. I'm going to put that there, and then I'm going to put a few more. And I will say I learned this from watching a video on the Just Get It Done Quilts channel, and she showed how to build a tape ledge. And I used that trick for this, because what this is going to do is give me a little bit of a bump. I think one more piece will be good. And make it easier for me to line up my fabric and sew it together and make sure my seam is straight, rather than pinning and trying to do it that way, because I think like a lot of people, maybe you used to do garment sewing. I did when I was very young, and I stabbed myself so many times with pins. I generally try to avoid pins. Let's sew the backing together. Got my fabric lined up, selvage to selvage. Bump the edge against that tape ledge. I'm going to start it, and I'm going to back it up a little bit just in case. Make sure it's nice and secure. I'll sew all the way down the length of the fabric. If you starched your quilt top, you want to starch your backing. I have a nice clean seam. It's a little thick. If you want, you could trim this off. I don't, because it gives it a little more stability. I am going to take it to the iron and press it. You guys know how to press. Let's talk about picking batting and how to measure for your binding. Here are some bags of batting. Unless you're working off a big roll, which is what I do now, you're probably going to buy something that will fit the size of your quilt. A couple different brands. Here's the Hobbs Heirloom. It says cotton batting, but do note that it's 80/20. This is what I use, and I have on a giant roll now. Missouri Star also makes a batting. This one is really flat. If you like flat batting, 80/20. And what's funny is these are all 80/20, but they all feel a little bit different. And this Happy Cloud is from Fat Quarter Shop. You can see I've used some of it on this one and on this one. This is 90 by 61. Remember our quilt measurement. that's gonna work. I'm gonna use that. That's my easiest option today. The 61, even though this is 54 top to bottom, so I added 4 on each side, 62. 61 for the batting will be fine. I'm not gonna have a problem with that, so I'm gonna just trim it up so I can use it for that. I do prefer an 80-20, reason being is the 20% poly keeps it from shrinking too much, and it's warm but not too warm. If you're in a cold climate and you want something really like puffy, they do make all polyester high loft, but that's really hot. I'm in Arizona, not going to work for me. So we're going to use this one today. Let's talk about binding. We're going to take all the sides of our quilts, 55, 55, 54, 54. I give myself 20 inches extra. You might be able to get away with 10 inches. That's because as you get to the corners of your quilt, you're folding your fabric when you're attaching your binding. When I sew my strips together, I do a straight seam join. I know some people like to do the bias join. This is just easier for me and it works fine. I'm not very picky. So let's add this up, okay? So you have 55, 55, 54, 54, and I'm going to give myself 20 inches extra just in case. It's probably about 10 inches too much, but that's okay. That gives me 238 inches. Now that's just the length to get around your quilt. How many 2.5 inch strips am I going to need? I'm going to be working with some yardage that I happen to have. So I've got this selvage to selvage stretch on this. This is from the Lori Holt stitch line. I think it's called Frosting Crosses or Frosting X's, something like that. So you're looking at, again, 42 inches selvage to selvage. But you're going to be cutting this off. That's a pretty thick selvage. I'm going to be losing about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to use 40 inches as my workable fabric space. So we've got 238. That's what I need to get around. And I'm in increments of 40. So 238 divided by 40. Calculator time, folks. 238 divided by 40. It's 5.95. So that means I'm going to need 6 strips. So even if I only added an extra 10 to this, if this was 228, it would still be 5 point something something, and I would need 6 strips. So that's going to be 6 strips top to bottom. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I cut my binding 2.5 inches. 6 times 2.5. Okay, 6 times 2.5. 15. So I need at least 15 inches of my yardage. Yeah, I'm covered. I'm good here. I can go ahead and cut my yardage on that. But that's how I figure my binding. Again, you can probably look online and find a binding calculator if you don't like doing math, and that's fine. If you have a quilt shop, you can go in and you can ask them. That works too. This is great for if you're doing scrappies. So let's say I was just doing a bunch of little pieces. I would know that I had to sew enough together to get to that length. That's also another way you can measure that. I'm going to go ahead and cut 6 2.5 inch strips from this. And again, if you've starched your top, you want to starch your backing and you want to starch your binding. That's because when you wash it, if one fabric is starched and the other isn't, they're going to shrink at different rates and it's going to look weird. Here's my 6 strips, and I cut off the selvage edges. I'm going to put these together and sew a straight seam, 1/4 inch seam allowance. I went ahead and ironed the first strip until I got to the seam, which is off camera. I'm going to go ahead and show you what I'm going to do with all the binding. Fold it in half. Don't burn your fingers. And you're just going to go all the way down. Just like that. Now you've got your binding. So what do you do with it until you're ready to use it? They make things that hold binding. Honestly, you can wrap it around a toilet paper tube, a paper towel tube, or what I like to do is just start wrapping it. And I've found that this cute little ceramic chicken tray that my mom gave me is great at holding binding. So I'm going to wrap mine and stick it in the chicken tray. Here's my binding. Now is a great time to make a label and tuck it right in here so it's ready to go. I do have a label, but it has my first and last name and location on it, so I'm not going to show it, but I'm going to tuck it right here, set this aside, and then we'll make another video for you. I will make another video for you. I'll show you how I load a quilt on the long arm so you can get a better understanding of why long arm quilters ask for so much extra fabric on top, bottom, and each side. And then we'll quilt it together. Let's go.